Now it's time to learn how to roll out our crust. For this video, I'm going to be showing you how to take the crust dough, pieces of little discs of dough that we made a little bit earlier, and how to roll those out successfully and put them into a pie plate to build your own pie of your choice. We're going to be making an apple pie today with my filling that we made in a previous video. So the important thing that you need down on your counter after you clean it, of course, is some nice amounts of flour. And the flour is going to prevent sticking. So I made my pie crust, which was flour, sugar, salt, egg, white vinegar, and ice water. And you're going to take your disc of dough, and this particular disc is going to be the bottom of our pie crust. The tricky part is how much flour should you put down? How much flour should you continue adding? And in this video, I'm going to try to give you some tips for how to not add too much flour, but also how to add enough flour to your board, because ultimately you don't want it to stick to your counter, but you also don't want it to be too dry, because too dry is going to make it a little bit tough and not as tasty. So I like to get my pie dough into a disc, and then you're going to take your rolling pin, get that floured as well, and we're going to go in a north, south, east, west direction, because your goal, and then I'm going to go in those diagonal directions as well. Your goal is to keep your pie into a nice circle, okay? So at this point, if you notice, I don't have a lot of flour at the top here, and if you notice it looking a little bit wet on the top or doughy on the top, it's probably going to be a little bit doughy in the bottom as well. So as I pick that up, as you notice, some of that was sticking to the bottom. So that means that I'm going to add a little bit more flour to my countertop here. And then I'm going to add more flour to my rolling pin, okay? Again, that's going to be preventing sticking. So I'm going to go in those diagonal northwest, east, west directions in an attempt to keep my nice circular shape. Feel free, if you're nervous about it sticking to the board, to kind of pick it up with your hands very gently and give it a nice little peek. If you see it sticking on the bottom, you need to get some more flour under there. If it looks okay, I actually will flip mine over from time to time. It's a little bit more of an expert move, but just takes time for you to flip it over successfully and not break it. So again, you want to keep moving in that diagonal direction. Try to keep your circle shape, and you want your pie crust to be about 1/8 of an inch thick or so. And what I like to do is use my pie plate as a gauge, okay? So if you take your pie plate and you look down the middle, do I have about 1 inch of space around my pie plate that I can use to be my crust? And at this point, I think this looks good. So I'm gonna take my knife and I'm going to cut around, and you can use those scraps for some, I call them pie fries. I cut them into pieces and I bake them in the oven with a little bit of cinnamon and sugar if you want to. But you can save those scraps for decorating as well. So I'm gonna move my scraps off to the side. And I personally think that an apron is a good choice of some garb to wear when you're making pies. So now I'm gonna take my dish off to the side, but we're not done with our rolling pin quite yet, okay? So I'm gonna loosen that, just make sure that that's gonna move for you there. And I'm just gonna move that out a little bit more, a little bit more of a circle shape. Kind of got an oval going on here. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna take my rolling pin, I'm gonna rest it onto my pie crust here. I'm gonna loop it up over and I'm gonna roll it onto my rolling pin, and then very gently roll that into my pie plate. This is a nice easy way to transfer your pie crust into your pie plate without having to pick it up with your hands and transfer and potentially rip it. So now we've reached a point here where I'm going to gently press that dough into my pan here. And if you notice, I have a little bit of excess, a little bit more than I probably need on this side. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull that off. Just like that. And there we go. So that is crust number 1 in the bottom of our pie plate. Time to show you how to fill it. All right, so with my pie filling, I'm gonna take my spoon and I'm gonna very gently scrape all of my cut up apples into the bottom of my pan here. Make sure if you have any juices that the apples give off, that you get those into the pan too. Sometimes the sugary and liquid mixture from the apples will kind of make a little liquid. You want to get that liquid in there because that has that flour that's going to allow your pie crust to thicken up really nicely inside your pie as it bakes. My uncle actually uses way more apples than this. He heaps his up. So he says, you know, heap it up, give it a lot of apples there. So we have our apples in there, and now we're going to take about a tablespoon of butter, and this is called dotting. So we're going to kind of scatter little pieces of butter around, and I always for some reason forget this part. Just kind of add some creaminess to your pie filling. So that is where our pie is going to be at before we do our top layer. So just to kind of review with you, I'm going to take this disc as well, and I'm going to go ahead and roll that out because this is going to be the top layer of our pie crust. Again, you want to make sure that you get enough flour down on the board. Make sure that you get flour on both sides of your pie crust there, or your pie dough rather. I guess it's not crust yet. And then make sure that you flour your rolling pin. And again, we're going to go in a north, south, east, west direction. And you want to try to see where are you losing your circle, okay, if you happen to be losing a circle. So you want to move that in different directions so that you kind of maintain the best circle shape that you possibly can. Sometimes you're going to end up with, you know, random shapes. I feel like I look at pie crust and I think, wow, what state does that look like? Hopefully you don't end up with like pie crusts that look like something like Florida, you know, little skinny, like can't get it into the pie crust. So now I notice that I need a little bit more flour. I'm going to go ahead and flip that over very gently. Now I do have a lot of flour there. I'm going to kind of push some of this flour off to the side because again, you don't want too much flour. And if you think you have too much there, you can kind of push some of that off of your dough. Okay. And one little tip I do recommend to you is that you only roll it out once. No matter how it looks, you just got to use it because once you take this and gather it up, it gets tougher to roll out. It's not like cookie dough where you can continue to roll it out over and over and over again. Kind of got one shot for it to be as easy as possible. So again, I'm going to take my pie crust and use my pie plate as a gauge here. So if I look around there, I can kind of eyeball where I want to cut for my top layer here. So I think that is going to look good. Just kind of cut away there. Try to keep it as circular as you can. Get those out of the way there. Okay. And again, we're going to use our rolling pin to roll up our crust. Move this back in the middle here so you can see it. Try not to squash it with your finger like I just did there. And again, we're gonna kind of put that on. So again, if you need to pull some of that off, you really just want maybe an inch of pie crust on top there. So you can kind of pull those pieces off if needed because you don't want to have too much of a crust on the edges because then it doesn't cook. Sometimes it's a little bit raw. So if needed, you can kind of trim that up, make it a nice circle, and pull off some of that excess. I'm going to show you how to crimp this and make it look a really nice pretty edge here coming up in a minute. All right, so we have both the bottom and the filling and the top crust in our pie. Now it's time to learn how to crimp a pie. So this is kind of the classic edging that you're gonna find in a pie. So I'm gonna show you how to do that. So we have two layers to our pie crust here. We have the top and then we have the bottom. Our goal is to take this top crust and the bottom crust, kind of pull them together. Don't need to pinch them, you just want them to be together. And you're gonna take your top crust and kind of roll it to a point in which it meets the pie plate. You're gonna do that the whole way around. And again, it's for this reason that you don't want too much excess pie crust on the edge, because this, if you had too much hanging here, if you didn't trim it off, it would get too humpy and this little crust here would actually not bake in the oven. So I really don't like to have more than an inch on the sides there. So as you roll it under, and again, you want the top crust to roll under the bottom crust. And that's gonna make for a nice little seal on your pie crust too, so that the filling doesn't bust out the edges and make a mess on your pan or on the bottom of your oven. Again, all right, once you get all of the top crust tucked under the bottom crust, now we're gonna do the crimping method. So basically think about taking your pointer finger and your thumb on one hand, your pointer finger and thumb on the other hand, and we're gonna do a crisscross motion like this. It's almost like a pinching. Don't wanna pinch too hard or you rip the dough. So basically you're gonna take your pointer fingers beside each other, kind of press them together with your thumbs on the other sides. I personally like to work right here, right in front of me at my 12 o'clock and work my way around like this. And it's a very easy motion. Again, you're kind of going like this with the dough, okay? Just like that. You can also use a fork to do a pressing motion. There's all kinds of things that you can do with pie dough to make it look pretty. Some people will do like the lattice structure on the top. That requires you to lay it out and you're cutting several strips and you're kind of weaving them together. Totally up to you. I always do this crimping method. This is kind of my go-to, just works for me. I think it looks really nice and pretty and homemade. And it just gives for a nice little finish, and I just think it looks nice. So that is my crimped pie. And what you definitely need to do as your last step here is to take your butter knife and to run that through the little pieces of your dough on the top to give it some vent holes. So if you forget to give it vent holes, it's gonna give itself its own vent holes somewhere else. So sometimes that's in the side of the pie, and then it gets all over your oven, so that's not too good there. The last thing that people typically do with the pie is they're gonna brush it with a little bit of milk. I'm actually out of milk right now, but you would brush the surface of your pie with a little bit of milk, and that promotes some nice, gives like a nice brown crispy crust. The last thing that you're gonna do with your pie is bake it. I recommend putting it onto a cookie sheet because sometimes you can still have some overflow from the filling of your pie on, outside of the pie plate. And you would rather that be on a jelly roll pan than on the bottom of your oven. So typically you're gonna bake pies. I know like my mom does 425 for 15 minutes and then kicks it back down to 350 degrees for 45 more minutes. I usually just stick mine in the oven at 350 degrees and I just let it bake in there for about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. You're looking for a golden brown color on your pie, and I'll show you what that looks like after it's done baking. Here is our finished pie. Couple things to look for when you're determining whether pie is done or not. Do you notice some bubbling? See that bubbling there? That means that that filling in there is fully cooked, has been bubbling and simmering in there for a while. And we're also looking for some golden brown edges, golden brown on the surface. And I also like to take a peek underneath. If you have a glass one, it works this way. If you notice that the crust underneath is golden brown under there, that's a good sign too. I can't wait to cut into this. One recommendation for you, I would let this pie sit for at least an hour before you cut it open because you want all of your filling to be nice and solidified. Even 2 or 3 hours, it's still going to be warm, but the longer you let it sit, it's going to have a chance to set up and be a nice, triangular piece of pie with filling that doesn't run out. So I hope you give this a try. I can't wait to try it myself.